Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, anyways, man, I thought that I would talk about this fight that is going to be happening next week. I believe that it happens on August 14th, which I believe will be next Saturday. Anyways, man, the Showtime boxing schedule was released quite a while ago, at least a few months ago, and there was a multitude of good fights that were on the card. There were some fights that I didn't necessarily think were great, but there's a couple of decent fights that were on there. Jamel Charlo versus Brian Castano, for example, I thought was an excellent fight, and that ended up panning out just like I thought that it possibly could. Or what I'm going to say is this. I did predict Jamel Charlo to win that fight, but I did say in my video that that could be a very potentially dangerous fight, and it did end up being a very potentially dangerous fight. Hopefully, we get to see a rematch between those two later on down the line. I think maybe you can argue that that was maybe the best potential fight on there. But my pick actually for the best possible potential fight on the Showtime schedule, at least from what I've seen, Gervonta Tank Davis versus Mario Barrios, even though I don't think that was an elite fight per se, I wouldn't necessarily say that it was a bad fight. It certainly was a good fight. But the best fight actually out of all the Showtime schedule that I personally seen was probably the John Riel Casimero versus Guillermo Rigondeaux fight. Now this is going to be not really a complete unification title fight from what I was led on to know a little bit later on. I believe Guillermo Rigondeaux only has a regular title, while John Riel Casimero, he actually has one of the major titles. So it's basically going to be Casimero, the Filipino here, defending his title, while Guillermo Rigondeaux, he tries to gain a title at 40 years old. Um, I think that this is a very interesting fight. I think it's a very intriguing fight. I'm very excited for this fight. I think that both of these fighters are top notch fighters at this point in time in their careers. The problem is, though, in my opinion, is that I believe that John Rio Casimero probably is at the best point in his career, and Guillermo Rigondeaux is 40 years old. Now, just because you're 40 years old does not always mean that you're not at a very decent point in your career. Obviously, a lot of people look at this fight and they see it as a 50-50 fight. But the question that I have is that is even a decent version of Guillermo Rigondeaux going to show up here? Now, Guillermo Rigondeaux, I'm not trying to make it sound like he's been horrible for the past few years, because that wouldn't be the truth. Guillermo Rigondeaux has actually won against some very decent opponents. I'm not necessarily sure if I would 100% call them 100% A-class fighters, but what I would say is this: they have been decent opponents. Guillermo Rigondeaux has shown his skill set. He's also shown a little bit of a change in style. Now, some people overall believe that that's because many people criticize his style as being a quote-unquote runner. Some people overall believe it's because his legs are starting to go. I believe maybe it can be a little bit of both. I think Guillermo Rigondeaux, he still does prefer to kind of be on the defensive when he has to be. But Guillermo Rigondeaux is 40 years old, and I think that's a little bit of the beating that he took against Lomachenko. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like that was Shane Mosley versus Antonio Margarito or anything. But, which of course what I mean by that is like a major ass whooping. But when it comes down to the overall, Lomachenko pretty much did embarrass him. He did beat him up, at least in some sort of way, and I do think he did embarrass Guillermo Rigondeaux. Bottom line is this: I think Guillermo Rigondeaux at this point in time in his career, I think he is a very decent fighter. The power is still there. I was able to see him hurt his last couple of opponents, even though you can actually argue that he was fortunate enough to get the win. The last fight that I believe I seen him in, it was a split decision. I believe against a fighter named Solis. If I'm wrong about that, then I could be mixing up the names, but correct me if I'm wrong. I seen Guillermo Rigondeaux get a split decision in that. Now, I thought Guillermo Rigondeaux did win the fight just by a clear few rounds, so I thought that it probably should have went to Rigondeaux. But it was a very close and competitive fight, and there were certain rounds where I thought Guillermo Rigondeaux took a little bit too many punches in certain areas, and overall was it could have been a little bit defensively better. And one thing I actually noticed about Guillermo Rigondeaux is that his defense on the inside, when he's actually on the inside with these fighters, I wouldn't necessarily call his defense on the inside 100% A grade. Some people would disagree. But actually, even when we take a look at Guillermo Rigondeaux at the best point in time in his career, every time that Guillermo Rigondeaux has actually been hurt in his career, or every single time that he's been knocked down in his career, it's always because the opponent was able to get up and close and personal, and usually was able to hit him with some sort of hook or something like that. Nonito Donaire was able to hit him with a left hook, which I believe knocked him down. Of course, he was able to get back up and win that fight. We've seen him against that one very tall, lanky Japanese fighter that one time. Guillermo Rigondeaux was able to, stop him eventually, I believe even in the final round. But it is possible to hurt Guillermo Rigondeaux. It always really has been. I'm not saying that he has a weak chin or anything, because I don't think that would be accurate, but he can be hurt. And when you talk about Guillermo Rigondeaux at this point in time in his career, when he's 40 years old, and I've seen him in his past couple of fights, and I'm not going to say that his legs are completely gone. I'm not going to say that he can't move around, that he can't, back up a little bit here and there. But when I take a look at certain Cuban fighters that especially relied a lot on that athleticism and the moving around and the circular motion and really kind of being on the defensive, it's going to be a lot harder now being at this age at 40 years old. It's going to be a lot harder. And Riel Casimero, when I take a look at him as a fighter, he's not someone who's always technically sound. That's why even at this age, I think that Guillermo Rigondeaux does have a decent chance. Like I said, to me, this is a 50-50 fight. If this were Guillermo Rigondeaux from 7-8 years ago, that Guillermo Rigondeaux that defeated Nonito Donaire, I would bet on Guillermo Rigondeaux to win this fight. I would probably say that this would be a 70-30 fight, and that Guillermo Rigondeaux probably would possibly knock Riel Casimero out. But this is a Guillermo Rigondeaux where in his past couple of fights, I've seen him struggle a little bit. I've seen him win, and I've even seen him hurt his opponents, because Guillermo Rigondeaux actually does have very, very decent power. A certain amount of people, may not realize that, but he does actually have very, very decent power, especially in that left hand of his. Guillermo Rigondeaux, I think that he has a decent chance in this fight. But if you had to ask me for my prediction, who do I think is going to win this fight? I'm going to go with Riel Casimero. I think that eventually in certain rounds he may outwork Rigondeaux, and there's a possibility that he may hurt Guillermo Rigondeaux. I think that if you're asking me who has more of a possibility of hurting who here, I think Riel Casimero, the Filipino here, has more of a chance to hurt Guillermo Rigondeaux, and a certain amount of people may disagree. This is a very big challenge for Guillermo Rigondeaux, and if Rigondeaux was actually able to get past Riel Casimero, I'd be very pleasantly surprised. And Guillermo Rigondeaux is one of my favorite fighters of the past 10 years. Always loved watching him. Always thought he was a very decent craftsman. Unfortunately, Cuban fighters, and if you know my channel long enough, I really like the Cuban fighters like Lara and Rigondeaux, at least, but actually some of the more defensive fighters. Lara actually is one of my favorite fighters of the past, I don't know how many years. But when it comes down to it, it's very unfortunate. But a lot of these Cuban fighters in the end, because they kind of get into boxing a little bit later than others and they start losing their athleticism, and because they do rely so much on defense, they eventually break down sometimes a little bit sooner than others. At times, not always. But when it comes down to it, on top of that, they're not really fighters that get promoted as well as some of the other fighters out there. They're always looked at as a very big threat but very low reward. And that's, so very big risk, very low reward. And those just aren't fighters that usually a lot of times are going to get the bigger fights out there. So I think it's very unfortunate how Guillermo Rigondeaux's career ended up. If he does, however, win this fight, though, I think that that's a big step in the right direction. Maybe then after that he can get even a bigger super fight after this. Because even though technically, I guess you could call this a super fight, I'm not sure if you would say that this is like on the level of like what Guillermo Rigondeaux versus Leo Santa Cruz would have been like, when they were both looked at their best. I'm not sure if you would compare it to that. But this still, at the end of the day, is a very decent fight. Riel Casimero is a real deal champion. I've seen this guy beat some very decent fighters, African fighters, within his past couple of fights. Zolani Tete was one of the decent lower weight class guys. He can box decent. Overall, he's had, I believe, that title for quite a while down there. And Riel Casimero was able to hurt him. He was able to knock him out, I believe, within 3 rounds. Same thing within Micah, I believe, who's a fighter, I believe, from Cameroon. If I'm wrong about that, someone correct me. Actually, he may not be from Cameroon. He might be from somewhere else. I may have mistaken that. I apologize. But when it comes down to it overall, Riel Casimero is a real threat. And my point being here is this. He has a lot of power. He can take a decent amount of damage. And Rigondeaux, he is a type of power that I'm not sure if Casimero is used to necessarily. Rigondeaux does have a lot of power. But if he can get past that power, if he can weather it within the first early rounds, and if Rigondeaux fights on the inside a lot of the times overall, like what he's been doing for his past couple of fights, and if he takes the type of shots that he's been doing for the past couple of fights, I don't know how well Guillermo Rigondeaux is going to last. I think it's very possible he may get hurt. He may even possibly get knocked out in this fight. What I'm going to say is this. This is a 50-50 fight. I wouldn't be surprised if this fight ended up being a split decision. Either way, I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up being a split draw. I wouldn't be surprised if either fighter actually won by knockout. I wouldn't be overly surprised. Anything can happen here. It's unfortunate, but I'm going to have to go with John Riel Casimero in this fight. Once again, I have to be logical and objective at the end of the day. That's my main objective. And I think John Riel Casimero, at the end of the day, his power, his speed, and the fact overall that he's just at a better age right now than Guillermo Rigondeaux. He's just at a better point in his career, and he's just a very big threat right now. Guillermo Rigondeaux, I think he's a very decent fighter, like I said, but when it comes down to it overall, it's just going to be very, very hard, I think, for Guillermo Rigondeaux to possibly pull off this fight. So we'll see what happens. But anyways, guys, that's really about it for today. Let me know overall what you guys think, and I'll talk to you all later.